Okay, so now we're picking up bottom of Ayin Tesla base, but literally last two words, 79b says the Gemara. Amar Reish Lakish. So Reish Lakish says, I will say this concept that we're somech on kruchim. So this is actually a very interesting idea. So here what we're saying is as follows: that if you have a woman and you have kids, and those kids follow after this woman, that lashon of kruchim, that is enough to solidify the genealogical fitness of the kids. The fact that they follow after her, that indicates that those are her children, and that's enough. So Reish Lakish says, Lo shanu ella b'kadshei gvul. That's only true halacha l'maisa, what we call kadshei gvul. Now, what's kadshei gvul? Look at Rashi. Lo shanu ella desamchinon akruchin ella kadshei gvul. Im koin hu ochlim b'kadshei gvul mishehebi raya ala isha. I'm just reading Rashi. She kshera l'kuna somchin ala banim akruchin achara lomar banahein ve'ein chalolim. So what is kadshei gvul? Kadshei gvul are things like truma and things like challah. Things that if you're a Kohen, you're allowed to eat wherever you are. They need not be consumed in Yerushalayim. They need not be consumed, of course, within the precincts of the Beis HaMikdash. So Reish Lakish is saying is like this. When we rely on kruchim, when we rely on the fact that these kids are following after this woman in order to be able to solidify that they are her children, that is only halacha l'maisa in kadshei gvul. That's only for things like truma and challah. The Gemara says, aval b'yuchsin lo. But interestingly enough, it doesn't work for yichus. It doesn't work for yichus, which I will say is a little bit ironic. Why? Because our whole topic over here is yichus, right? In other words, we're not talking about consumption of kohanic gifts or kohanic entitlements. We're talking about yichus. Yet Reish Lakish comes along and says, kruchin, children following after a mother, only works for kadshei gvul, does not work for yichus. Rabbi Yochanan says, afilu biyuchsin. Rabbi Yochanan says, no, it works even for yichus. Even for yichus.
Maybe okay for yichus of Yisrael, but not for a Kohen.
That could be also good. We're gonna drill down to that a little bit more. Mirz Hashem. Yeah. So Rashi says over here, aval yuchsin. Rashi says, im yesh bahen banos eino nisas lekohanim. Now, in general, remember for yuchsin, the major piece of yichus is always for the kahuna. Right? In other words, as long as we're not talking about a situation of potential mamzerus or something like that, right? The concern is usually for marriage into the kuna. Absolutely. So Rabbi Yochanan says, "Afilu b'yochsin." I'm sorry.
Is it true with your mother?
True with your Daraisa. So Rabbi Yochanan says, "Afilu b'yochsin." Right? So Rabbi Yochanan's idea over here is that no, this works even for yichus. Kruchin is enough to go ahead and say that halacha l'maisa, this family, these children are miyuchas, and therefore these girls, if they are daughters, can marry even into the kahuna. But Rabbi Yochanan goes according to his reasoning. It's actually fascinating. The Gemara says, "The Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Malkin ala chazakos, v'soklin v'sarfin ala chazakos, vein sarfin shuma ala chazakos." Let's listen to this. Rabbi Yochanan holds in general that halacha l'maisa, you could do like this. He says you could administer malchus on the basis of a chazaka, right? Remember again, let's just define our terms. A chazaka, how would you define chazaka? Right? A presumption which creates halachic reality. Right? So chazaka says we know things to be a certain way because at one point in time, we know things were a certain way, and chazaka says if things were a certain way, we continue to assume that they are that way until we know to the contrary. So Rabbi Yochanan says something very interesting. Rabbi Yochanan says that halacha l'maisa we administer malchus based on chazaka, and we go ahead and we administer skila, right, and sreifa based on chazaka, but we won't burn truma based on chazaka. Okay, now we'll say now that's a lot over there, right? Remember, when do we burn truma? What kind of truma do you burn? Truma tmeya. Right, truma tmeya can't, right? You burn it. So watch this. So what's malkin al chazakas? What does it mean that you administer malchus based on a chazaka? Rabbi Yehuda, Huchs is interesting. Huchsaka nida b'shchenosah. Let's say a woman established a chazaka as a nida in her neighborhood. And I will say now, where halacha? Now, what does that mean? That a woman established. So again, remember, Rashi says, "Sharau shchenosah shihi hayom haisa melubeshes bigdei nidusa." Now remember, Bismana Gemara, we passed Bismana Gemara, so it's common for a woman to wear separate clothing during the days that she was in Nida. So what's the case over here? The neighbors see that she's wearing her Nida clothing. So because she's wearing her Nida clothing, so therefore again, halacha l'maisa, she has a cheskas nida. So baila lo kala mishum nida. So if her husband were to have relations with her, that would be enough for Beis Din to flog him based on the fact that she is wearing her big day nida. Now, of course, remember, we don't know, is she a nida, is she not a nida? Maybe she ran out of clean clothing, and that's what she's wearing. Lamaisa, again, wearing clothing of nida is enough to establish cheskas nida, which is enough to cause him to be flogged if he has relations with her. So the Gemara says, soklin v'sarfin ala chazakos. What does it mean that we administer skila or sreifa based on a chazaki? Kidirava barafuna, ish v'isha tinok v'tinokes. This is a fascinating case. You have a man and a woman, a young boy and a young girl, shigdilu b'soch habayis. And both say, so imagine the following case. You have a situation where people present as a family. People present as a family. Now, are they a family? Are they not a family? They present as a family. So what's the halacha? So niskalin ze al ze. So I will say, so now this is fascinating. So let's say you have people move into a community. Man, adult woman, young boy, young girl. You see that circumstantially, it looks like they are a family, right? But now let's say halacha lamaisa, then suddenly again people within that unit begin having relations with each other. So the Gemara says, what's the halacha? Niskalin ze al ze v'nisrafin ze al ze. That was just to point out the difference between skila and sreifa. Again, skila is obviously stoning, sreifa is burning. Skila would be the punishment ultimately again for relations between a mother and a son. Sreifa is between father and the daughter. So that's what it means when it says niskalin v'nisrafin. So both say, so again, do we know that adult man, adult woman are father, mother to the young children? Do we know that? We don't know that. But we have a chazaka that we've seen them living together as a family, so that presumption ultimately allows us to take legal action against them. So Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi, Rabbi Shmuel ben Levi, Mushul bar Kafra, listen to this, Maisa be'isha shebasa Yerushalayim. Let's say, by the way, so there's a story of a woman that came to Yerushalayim. Say, how incredible is it to sit in Yerushalayim, right? All the time. When everything brings about Maisa of Yerushalayim, I'm 6,000 miles away, right? What a zechus. I mean, this is not a good story, I just want to point out, right? But nevertheless, it's better to learn a bad story in Yerushalayim Yirah Kodesh than to learn the best story in Galus. So the Gemara says as follows. So Maisa be'isha shebasa Yerushalayim v'tinok murkav al ksefa. So story of a woman who came to Yerushalayim, and when she came to Yerushalayim, she was holding a baby on her shoulder. Big deal also. Then the baby grew up. Uba and ultimately she had relations now with this boy, or with this young man. Ve'evim lebeiznin, v'saklam, they brought him to Beis, and ultimately again gave skila. So the Gemara says, Lo mipnei shebna vadai, ela mipnei shekarach achara. Both say it's incredible. It's incredible. So Beis administered a death penalty. Now, do we know for sure that this is mother and this is son? Do we know that for sure? We don't know it for sure. But rather, again, there's a pretty good halachic presumption about this, considering the fact that she was introduced, in other words, the way they were introduced to us in the community was as mother and son, and that's the way they lived. So incredible. They insarf in truma ala chazakas, but we won't burn truma based on chazaka. So the Gemara said, Rabbi Shimon Lakish sarfin ala chazakos. Right? Rabbi Lakish says we burn truma based on a chazaka. Rabbi Yochanan Amar in sarfin. Rabbi Yochanan says no, we don't. Vazlo tamayo. So I'll say, where do we see this case? This is quite fascinating. Vazlo tamayo. This nan. Tinok shinim tzavetsara isa ubatsek biado. Listen to this case. If you find a child by the side of, standing right by isa, right by dough, and what happens? Batsek biado. There's a piece of dough in his hand. So Rabbi says, so in general, look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says over here, ubatsek biado biadua shenatal mina isa. Now obviously, again, if you know that halacha l'maisa, that he's holding on the dough, so holding the dough, what does that mean? That means you know that he touched it, right? So you know that the child touched the dough. So what's halacha? So the Gemara, Rabbi Meir says, ultimately the dough is tar. The rest of the dough is tar. Chacham say, no, the dough is tamei. Why? Because it is the derech of a child ultimately to go ahead and what? To touch things. In other words, we'll say, if you look at Rashi over letapeach, b'shratzim unavela sheba ashpa. It's the derech of a child to touch things, garbage, shratzim. So therefore, because it's the derech of a child to touch things, so therefore what? So watch what's happening over here. The assumption is that the kid touched shratzim, and now I know that what? I know that the child touched the isa. How do I know that the child touched the isa? How do I know that? because he's holding a piece of Isa in his hand. So when you put those two things together, Chachamim say, ultimately again, it's Tameh, it's Truma Tameah, and therefore you could burn it. V'avinamba, my time with Rabbi Meir. So we'll say, what's Rabbi Meir's logic for saying that it's tar? So I understand the Chachamim who say that you'll burn the Truma in this case, because again, the derech of the child is to touch garbage and shratzim, right? I know that the kid touched the Isa. How do I know that? Because he's holding a piece of it in his hand. So it makes sense to say you're going to burn it. What's the logic of Rabbi Meir says you're not going to burn it? To which the Gemara says, Kasavar rov tinokos metapchin umiot im metapchin. It's fascinating, because Rabbi Meir will say like this. Why, it's true. The majority of children play around with shratzim and garbage. Garbage is not really the problematic piece of it. It's much more the shratzim. Umiot im metapchin. But a minority doesn't play around with it, with the shratzim. The Isa becheskas tara meles. Now the dough itself, remember again, has a cheskas tara. Right, the dough itself is a cheskas tara. So the Gemara says, "Samuch miuta lechazaka Israeli ruba." It's fascinating. Sarah will say, "What does Rabbi Meir say?" Rabbi Meir says, "Take the miut. Take the miut. What's the miut? There's a minority of kids who don't play with shratzim. Take that miut, combine it with what? The cheskas tara of the dough. So now you have a miut and a chazaka. A miut and a chazaka together are enough to what? To override the rov." To override the rov. Now that's the rov, ultimately, again, that the rov of children go ahead and play with shratzim. And therefore, again, that's why Rabbi Meir says we could say that the dough is tahar. V'rabbanon miuta kimandales dami. The Rabbanon say a miut is something as if it doesn't exist. I would say this is a general fundamental machlokes when it comes to rov and miut. So when you have a majority of something, right, how do you view the minority? Is the minority ultimately, again, viewed as if it simply doesn't exist? Or no, the minority does exist. So we'll say, so just to give you a classic example of this, we know that midaraisa chad betray is bottle, right? Midaraisa on a biblical level, if you have a majority of, let's say you have two pieces of kosher meat, one piece of non-kosher meat, midaraisa, right? The minority is bottle in the majority. So what does that mean? In other words, are you allowed to eat all three pieces of meat or not? So this is a fundamental machlokes harishonim, and it all depends on how you view miut. Do we say that when there's a rov, the miut disappears? And therefore, again, what we say is, tada, there's no kosher meat over here, right? The miut ceases to exist, and therefore you can eat everything. Or no, the miut is there. The miut is there. It's just with every single piece of meat, akitaina, this is part of the rov. This is part of the rov. So again, it's interesting to see over here that that's the machlokes Rabbi Meir and the Chacham as well. Rabbi Meir will say the miut is there. So therefore, you can take the miut, go ahead and combine it with the chazaka, that the dough was tahar, and that's enough to go ahead and essentially combat the rov that the majority of kids play with shratzim. That's right. Chacham, on the other hand, they're going to say that halacha l'maisa, the miut as if it is as if it doesn't exist. So therefore, what you have is rov of kids play with shratzim, chazaka, ultimately again that the kids. Chazaka, that the dough is tar, and therefore, ultimately, again, the rov will overcome the chazaka. So the Gemara says, v'rabbanon, miuta k'may l'esadami. Good. So the Gemara says, ruba v'chazaka, ruba adif. And the Rabbanon will say the miut as if it doesn't exist. Therefore, what you have over here is a clash between rov and chazaka. And when you have a clash between rov and chazaka, rov wins. Rov wins. Which is fascinating. In other words, Rabbi say, just why is it that when there's a clash between rov and chazaka, rov wins? What's the logic behind that? Chazaka is based on what was. Right? So Chazaka says, we say what was is what is. Rov tells you what? Rov tells you what? What is right now. So when you have a clash between, again, Rov and Chazaka, that's why Rov ultimately, again, wins out. It's an interesting, hashkafically also, it's a fascinating idea that what determines reality is much more what is right now than what was. If you can't figure out what is right now, you can rely on chazaka. But if there's a way of determining ultimately, again, what is right now, it's like the Balatanya brings down in the concept of what's the definition of a tzaddik, what's the definition of a rasha. So the Benoni, the Balatanya says, again, it's a big arichos, but the Balatanya explains that your status is determined by where you're holding right now. So if I'm doing a mitzvah, right now I'm a tzaddik. But 1 second, 2 minutes ago I was doing an aveira, and 3 minutes ago I was also doing an aveira, because 7 minutes ago I was also doing an aveira. So Balatanya says, your status is not defined by what was, your status is defined by what is. So if I'm doing a mitzvah right now, I am a tzaddik. I am a tzaddik. Conversely, if I'm doing an aveira right now, I'm a rasha. Ba'asher Usham. It's this fascinating clash in Yiddishkeit. I always say like the most incredible words, the best words in the entire Shas. Best words are Maida Hava Hava. What was. The best words, it's liberating. It's liberating, right? Because all of us, like, we schlep around so much stuff from our mistakes of the past. The Gemara says, leave it alone. Maida Hava Hava. And it's interesting because hashkafically that's being reinforced over here. You have a clash between Rov and Chazaka, between past and present. What wins out? Present. The power of the Jew in general is the ability to live in the present, the ability to define myself by what is the present. Balatanya, if I'm holding in a good... So we'll say right now, we're learning Gemara, tzadikim. But what about later on? What about beforehand? Doesn't make a difference. Basher Sham, where I am right now. Again, the Gemara goes right. Zuhi says, Shesarfen Allah asat truma. This is a case, ultimately, again, where we will go ahead and burn truma, as we just mentioned before. Rabbi Yochanan says, no, that's not a case where we'll burn truma. So what is the case when Rabbi Yochanan, where ultimately, again, you'll burn truma? Kiddushin. So I'll say this is a fascinating case. So Rabbi Yochanan will disagree. He'll say the previous case we mentioned of the tinok, of the child, who clearly grabbed off a piece of Isa, Rabbi Yochanan will say we won't burn truma in that case. Rabbi Yochanan, so what is the case where you will burn truma? What is the case? So watch this, Rabbi. This is fascinating. Kiddushin. Isa b'soch habayitz, u'tzrasim u'tzfardim metaplin sham. So we'll say, now watch this. You have in the house, you have shratzim and svardim, right? So you have a sheretz and a frog. Now we'll say, if you look at Rashi, it's actually interesting. Rashi says, second one line in Rashi, shratzim tzav hadom l'tzvardeya, hatzav tami bar tzvardeya tar. So I will say, this is actually quite fascinating. So a tzav is a toad. So a toad apparently, again, is a sheretz, but a frog is not. It's fascinating. But obviously, again, I don't know, I couldn't tell if I've ever seen a frog and a toad, right? Apparently, again, they resemble each other. So now watch this. Here's the case. So let's say you have dough, which is tar inside of the house, and shratzim u'tzradim metaplin sham, but you also have toads and frogs in the house. So remember again, toads, a sheretz, shratzim convey tuma to ochlim, to food. Obviously, a frog will not. V'nimtzu chatichos bi'isa. And what do you find? You find little animal parts inside of the dough. Now, the good news is you could just pick them out, right? But the shaila is, did the dough become tamei or not? So I will say, now the shaila is apparently, toad pieces, good to know, toad pieces and frog pieces look the same, right? So now the shaila is, right, you don't know what you're paying. I will say, I just want to point out, it's incredible, right? To us, we see a Gemara like this, and what's your first reaction? Just throw it out, right? So it's fascinating. We are part of such a disposable society, right? But again, once upon a time, you find little pieces of something inside a dough. You pick it out. That's what you do. You pick it out and you try to figure out now, is it ritually pure or not? So we'll say, so what's the halacha? So here we go. Says the Gemara, Imrov shratzim tamei. If the majority of stuff in the house are shratzim, then ultimately again it will be tamei. Imrov tzvardim, if the majority ultimately are frogs, then tahora. Ultimately again it will be tahar. So the Gemara says, Tanya kavasei de Rabbi Yochanan. So Bryce will express Rabbi Yochanan. Shtei dvarim ein bahem das lishal, v'asomchu chachamim kima sheyesh lem das lishal. So I just want to point out over here, everyone will agree, or there seems to be that everyone agrees that halacha l'maisa, there is a situation, or there is a scenario in which you will go ahead and burn something. You'll burn truma, or you'll burn the isa based on a suffix, right? There is, or based on a chazaka, right? So over here, or based on a rov. The machlokes just is which case you're going to allow to fall into that category. So the Gemara says, there's a brayso that's supposed to be Yochanan. Shnei dvarim ein b'hem das lishal. There are two things that Rabbi say, technically speaking, ein b'hem das lishal. What does it mean, ein b'hem das lishal? You don't have the ability to inquire of them about the actual reality of the circumstances. However, I'll define that better in just a moment. But Chazal made it as if they do have a das lishal. Now I will say, now in general, take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says, or it's actually the last Rashi on the daf. Rashi says, Kimishi with das lishal the kaimalon b'rishas hayachid sveiko tame. The b'davar she'imbo das lishal kaimalon dafilu b'rishas hayachid sveiko tar. I will say, remember, when it comes to tumah, we generally have two operating principles. Operating principle number one is Safek tumah birshus hayochid is going to be tameh. That's based on sota, and Safek tumah birshus harabim is going to be tahar. That's piece number one. Piece number two is we have a general along that same lines. If you have a Safek tumah birshus hayochid, b'mishi yesh lo das lishal. In order for Safek tumah, doubtful case of tumah, to be tameh in rishus yachid in private domain, the object, so to speak, or person involved in the tumah has to have the ability to converse. You have to be able to ask a question. This is all based on sota. But if halacha l'maisa, the person or the object to that matter is ein bodas lishal, you don't have the ability to converse with them, to ask them about the circumstances of their tumah, then ultimately, again, sveiko is tahar. There are two exceptions to this rule. There are two times that Chazal went ahead and took something that doesn't have das lishal and made it as if it has das lishal. What are the two cases? So the Gemara says, Tinok va'od acheres. It's the case of the child and the additional one. So Tinok hadam. So we'll say the Tinok case. That's the case we just said before. That's the case of the kid who's playing next to the dough, has a piece of dough in his hand, and what? And again, we say that the dough is going to be tameh. Why? Based on the fact that rove, ultimately again of children, play around with shratzim. What's the other case? Listen to this case. You have a piece of dough inside of the house, right? Or a dough inside of the house. V'tarnagolim, you also have chickens, right? You also have chickens. Lebedig, right? Beforehand you had toads and frogs. Baruch Hashem, now you have chickens. So v'tarnagolim umashkin tmeim sham. Now I will say you have chickens, and you also have impure liquids inside of the house. So watch this. What's the halacha? Umashkin tmeim sham v'nimtzu, and you find Amud Beis. V'nimtzu nikurim be'isa. There was an interestingly enough, what else do you find inside of the house? What do you find inside of the house? You find little, what's the right word? Nikurim. Peck marks, right? So it's clear that what happened, that the chicken's been pecking at the dough. So we'll say, what's the halacha? Now we'll say, let's just frame this. What am I concerned about over here? What am I concerned about? So I've got dough, right? I've got dough which is tars. Good. I have chickens. Status of chickens. Chickens are chickens, they're fine. Right? Where's the problem? The problem is now I have mashkim tameim. I have impure liquids. So what's my concern? My concern is that the chickens drank from the mashkim tameim and then went and pecked inside of the dough. That's my issue, and that's my real concern over here. So what's the halacha? Tolin. So we'll say tolin means we essentially keep this dough in like suspended animation. In other words, we kind of just leave it. Lo ochlin velo sarfin. We're not going to eat it because it might be tameh, but we're not going to burn it. Why are we going to burn it? Why not? Because it might not be tameh. And obviously, again, burning truma that's not tameo is a pretty significant transgression. Take a look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, Tolin, im isa zu shel truma, chashinun shema shasa tanagolim mimashknat tameim, ubaot hamashke tofeach bechar tumeim, nikru bi'isa, so good. Umidika amar shtei dvarim halalu asam kimisha asu, bo das lishal, v'shaninu ba'achas and Tolin, michlal de tinok, Tolin. So we'll say, so again, here's another example, by the way, of a case of ein bo das lishal. Right? There's no ability, obviously, to inquire of the chicken. No, tell me, chicken, what happened? Right? Tell me what happened over here. You can't do that. And yet, again, halacha l'maisa, we're still told him. This is only true ultimately, again, when you have clear liquids. So we'll say, what's the chap with clear liquids? Clear liquids, I don't know what happened or not. See, we'll say, what do I know? What do I know what happened in this case over here? The only thing I know is that what? Chickens pecked it. What don't I know? Did the chickens drink some of the water and bring enough of the liquid to the dough and peck it with the liquid wet enough on its beak to convey moisture to the dough and thereby convey to the dough? I don't know that. So the Gemara says, "Aval mashkim adumim im isa denikar meid de yadia." But again, if halacha l'maisa, again, it was red liquids, then I will say red liquids. If the chicken pecked at it, then what? I would know that it was in the dough. So the Gemara says, "Dilma balasina isa." Maybe not. Maybe even in the case of red liquid, isn't there always the possibility that maybe again the moisture got absorbed by the dough and you can't see it? Rabbi Yochanan davar zeh shemiya berevi upershu. Upershu. I'm sorry. Uperusho lo shemiya. Amar Rabbi Yochanan davar zeh shama beribi. I heard this particular halacha from Beribi. Rabbi Shmuel Levi Rashi says uperosha lo shama. But again, I didn't hear the full explanation. Lo shano ela b'mashkim selulim shebuvar shal tinok nikerba. Well, so even with red liquids, right, or even with liquids in general. So the Gemara says, when do we say that there's a suffix about whether or not the chicken went ahead and took some of the liquid and then packed the dough? That's talking about clear liquids. Clear liquids. Ultimately, again, what's the definition of clarity? That you could see the bavua, the reflection. Thank you. You can see the reflection of the child in the liquid itself. First, let's look at Rashi just a moment. Perel Shira, we just finished up the Mishnah. Perel Shira, the ba'adumim nami haylo lefaresh ulechalik bein tzlum achurim. So I just want to point out what's happening over here. That Rabbi Yochanan is saying, I heard the explanation from Rabbi Shmuel Levi, and I never really fully explained it. Now here's the full explanation. Rabbi Shmuel Levi is clarifying, even in the case of red liquids, there's still a suffix. Because you could have a case in red liquids where the liquid itself is still clear enough to be able to see the reflection of a child in the liquid itself, lav dafka child, reflection of anyone in the liquid. That could be a case where inachinami, it might have been absorbed into the dough. Aval mashki machurim lo. But obviously, again, if the liquid itself is dark enough that you can't see the reflection, then einachinami, in that case, if the chicken would have touched the liquids and then gone ahead and packed at the dough, I would have known that. And if I don't see that there for halacha l'maisa, again, I could assume it didn't happen. So bottom line, we'll stop over here. The bottom line was coming out is like this. If it's clear liquids, then einachinami, that's going to be the case of tolin, because I don't know. If it's red liquids, then what's the halacha? It depends on the nature of the liquid. If it's a lighter shade of red, that you can see the reflection of a child in it, then einachinami, that'll still be a suffix because maybe it was absorbed. But if it's a darker red, then halacha l'maisa, if it's true that the chicken really pecked at it, then you would see that in the dough itself. And if you don't see it in the dough, that's indicative that the chicken didn't peck at it.
Then you can be sorofit.
And if you see it, then you could be sorofit. And if you don't see it, you can eat it. You can eat it because it wouldn't be suffix in that case either. All right, Rabbi say, shkoyach. Tomorrow morning, same time in their side. All right, Rabbi say, good morning. We are continuing on Pei Amud Beis 80b at the Mishnah, and Mishnah says as follows. So this actually introduces the interesting topic of yichud. So lo yisachid adam im shtei nashim. A man should not be alone with two women. Aval isha achos misyachadis im shtei nashim. So this is actually interesting. So one man shouldn't be alone with two women, but one woman has the ability to go ahead and be alone with two men. Rabbi Shimon says, af ish echad misyachid im shtei nashim. Rabbi Shimon says, one man could also be alone with two women, bisman she'ishto imo, as long as his wife is with him. So again, so interestingly enough, so remember, Rabbi Shimon is not really arguing, right? So Mishnah introduces us to the concept of yichud, that a man is not, that there's a concept of seclusion. Now the parameters of seclusion in Eretz Yisroel we have to see. So principle number one, a man shouldn't be alone with two women, but a woman is allowed to be alone with two men. Rabbi Shimon says again, a man could be alone with two women, as long as his wife is with him. The Yashin Imai Mepundiki. So Rabbi Shimon even takes it a step further. Not only could a man be alone with two women, but a man could even be, now literally it means sleeping in the same inn. But what the Gemara Rashi explains is that a man ultimately could even be sleeping in the same room as other women, as long as his wife is with him. Why? Ultimately, again, because his wife guards him. And I will say the truth is, in general, it's a profound yisod in marriage. I think in any good marriage, any husband could point to multiple times that his wife has saved him and guarded him from making some pretty dramatic and traumatic mistakes. That lashon of mipnei she'ishto mishamarto is a fascinating concept. Misyachid adam im imo v'im bito. A man could be alone with his mother, with his daughter. V'yashin imahem b'kirav basar, and he even has the ability to go ahead and sleep with them in the same bed. Now, b'kirav basar. Good morning, Kivano. Right, b'kirav basar means with physical contact. With physical contact between their bodies. So we'll see that more in the Gemara. V'migdilo, but once they become of age, yeshena b'ksusasa, v'zu yashem b'ksuso. They can sleep in the same bed, but but both of them have to sleep clothed. Okay, so a lot to unpack in this Mishnah. So we'll say, so first, the concept over here is that the Gemara is introducing us to the concept of yichud, the idea that ultimately, again, men and women, there are parameters as to seclusion between men and women. So the first thing the Gemara says is, my taima. So first of all, remember, the Mishnah introduces us to the concept of yichud with a specific halacha, namely, that one man can't be alone with two women. Now, obviously, we'll say, what are we concerned about? So we're obviously concerned about immoral or illicit behavior. So why is it that one man can't be alone with two women? So my Tana debe ilio hoil v'noshim daiton kalos aleihem. So we'll say, so again, fascinating concept. So literally translated. So first of all, look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, my taima lo yisached im shtein noshim ki isha k'shemisyachedis im beis anoshim. So really, what the Gemara is asking is like this. The Gemara is not asking as much as why can't men and women be alone with each other. So that's intuitive and that's obvious about the potential problems with that. What the Gemara is asking over here is the interesting distinction between one man can't be alone with two women, but yet one woman could be alone with two men. Why that distinction? So the Gemara says, Noshim daitos kalosein. So Rashi says, Daiton kalon alehen, ushteyen nochos leis pasos. So apparently in the eyes of Chazal, there was a greater possibility that when it's one man with two women, that the women would be agreeable to sin, right? More than ultimately, again, one woman with two men. One woman with two men. That apparently with two women, they would agree to sin and cover for one another. But men, which interesting enough, so you see over here, men are a bit more focused on pride than women are. Men wouldn't cover for each other. So men wouldn't sin in the presence of the other. Women would sin in the presence of one another. Interesting. Just as an aside, it's not our topic for today. In general, the concept of nashim daitan kalin alehem, which is often looked at as a disparaging remark about women, is not meant by Chazal to be a disparaging. First of all, in general, the role of women, the nature of women, obviously also was understood in a societal context, very different in the times of the Gemara than it is today. But also in general, the concept of Nashim Daitis Kalas Aleim is not a disparaging remark, but rather it represents the idea of the different temperaments between men and women. And the idea, I'll tell you just, no, we don't have time for a story, but if we have time, I'll come back later on. I'll tell you very quickly. So I remember when I was first married, I was learning in Kolov, and we had one car. So my wife picked me up on a Sunday afternoon after afternoon Seder, and we were learning. I remember Maseches Nida. I remember this, and we were learning Parak Hamapelas, which talks about if a woman miscarries. And the Gemara has all these interesting cases of Hamapelas Kimin Sandal, that if you go ahead and you abort something that is like a fetus, like shaped like a sandal, so is it a birth, is it not a birth? Tumas Leida, not Tumas Leida. So I was newly married, I'm in the car. Remember those days like when you're newly married and all you talk is Torah, right? It lasts about 4 minutes, right? And then so I said, what did you learn? And so I started rattling off all the stuff on my palace. And I remember my wife turned white. Right? She's like, I don't understand. This woman just went through this traumatic episode. How could it be that the Gemara's entire fixation is on whether or not she has Tumas Lida? And that was the first time, and I remember thinking to myself, to be honest, that thought never actually crossed my mind. I never for a second thought about a person, right? I was thinking about a halachic construct. And I realized that perhaps, again, also, that's what Chazal were referring to, just the fundamental different makeup between men and women. How men have the ability to be totally, almost rational to the exclusion of emotion, which is an unhealthy thing, whereas women have the ability to bring emotion in a positive way into every single thing. So Dait is called das usually represents intellect. Right, so Dait and Kalslein doesn't mean that someone is not smart, and doesn't mean but rather Dait and Kal mean that a man could look at something totally intellectually and rationally devoid of emotion. The koach of a woman is the ability to bring emotion into everything. Okay, again, not necessarily shaykh to this, but just an important qualification in this concept. In any event, the Gemara says, so where do we know this from? So now the Gemara is asking over here, so from where do I know the concept in general of yichud? So Rabbi Shmuel, Remez Lichud and Atar B'nai. From where do we know Remez to Yichud? From where do we see ultimately, again, a concept, a hint to yichud, shene'emar, ki yisischa achicha ben imecha. So remember again, the Torah over here is talking about the mesis. So the mesis is someone who tries to convince you to go ahead and do avodah zarah. So the Gemara says, it's actually interesting how the Torah phrases it. If your brother, the son of your mother, tries to convince you to do avodah zarah, asks the Gemara, v'chi ben aim mesis, ben av eno mesis. I don't understand. It's only your maternal brother who's going to convince you to do something bad, but your paternal brother is not going to make you do something bad. Ela lomer lecha is interesting. Ben misyachid im imo, so va'asra lisyachid im kol harash b'torah. Rather, we'll say, what does it teach you? It teaches you that a son is allowed to be alone with his mother. Now, where do you get that from? The idea of Rabbi say, when can you convince someone to do something bad? It's an interesting idea. When can you do that? When you exploit a close relationship. So the idea is someone who has nothing to do with you, they're not going to convince you to do something bad. Someone with whom you have a close relationship, that's who could convince you to do something bad. So who does the Torah use as a paradigmatic example of someone who you're close to? Your maternal brother. Why are you close to your maternal brother? It must be because you're spending a lot of time with him. Right? Why? Because you're spending a lot of time in the same house with your brother and your mother. So the Gemara says, from here you see that you're allowed to be alone with your mother. Now, you'll say to yourself, my gosh, why do Chazal need a drasha that I'm allowed to be alone with my mother? It's very simple. My mother is an erva. My mother is an erva to me, right? She's one of the arayos. So I would have thought that because she's one of the arayos, maybe there's an isser yichud. Kamash malo, no. Even though my mother is an erva, I am allowed to be alone with her. But the fact that there's a drasha to teach me that I'm allowed to be alone with my mother tells me what? That there's a concept of yichud by other arayos. Now, again, to be clear, the concept of yichud is dirabanan. Right? It's clear, it's dirabanan. It's not oraisa, but rather, again, it's a remez. A scriptural allusion, as they say. So the Gemara says, fine. So I will say, so that's the drasha. So this is from where Chazal went ahead and took this concept of yichud. I asks the Gemara, Pashte de Krabamaiksiv. So I will say, okay, that's very nice, beautiful drasha. What's the Pash Pshat? Right? What's the simple understanding of this? So the Gemara says, Rabbi, Lomi boy kamar. So Lomi boy ben av disani le va'ayitz le eitzos ros. So as it goes without saying that halacha l'maisa, right? When my paternal brother gives me an eitzah to go worship avodah zarah, the chances are I'm not listening to anything my paternal brother says. Why? Because I will say there's always an inherent animosity between paternal brothers. Why? Like most good family machlokes happens over money. So there's a natural strife between paternal brothers because remember, they're always a shtickle competitive for Yerusha. So when my paternal brother goes ahead and tries to tell me do something bad, I'm not going to listen because I know what he's trying to get me out of the will. Right? So the Gemara says, Ela afilu ben aim delos sanile. Maternal brothers often don't have that same level of competition, right? Ema sayis, I might have thought I should listen to him. Kamash malon, no. Kamash malon, that again, Torah is telling me, even if your maternal brother, with whom you have no inherent strife, tries to get you to go ahead and do something you're not allowed to do, make sure to resist the temptation. So the Gemara says, our Mishnah doesn't reflect the view of Rabbi Shmuel. What does Rabbi Shmuel say? Rabbi say, now remember, what he's talking about over here is our Mishnah, which talks about the halachos of yichud, which says that a man is not allowed to be alone with two women, right? Is not in conformance with the position of Abba Shal, because Abba Shal says a man can be alone with two women. What does Abba Shal say? This is incredible. Abba say, Disanya, Kol Shloshim Yom, Yotzin B'cheik, B'nikbar, B'isha Achos Ushni Anoshim. Abba say, when a baby, Rachmana Litzlan, passes away, so the idea over here is that they carry out the baby. They carry out the baby. Literally, again, the parent goes out carrying out the baby. Look at Rashi. Kol Shoshim Yom Vlad Sameach Vlad Shemes Besoch Shloshim Yom Ein Sarach Lechabdo B'Moso Lo Tzia Lekvura Lo B'Mita V'Lo B'Kliva El B'Cheik. So the idea is generally, again, when taking out the mace, they would take out the body b'mita on a beer, on a funeral beer. A baby is just held in the hand. I'll tell you something amazing. We were just yesterday in Hebron, and we were walking from the Ma'ara to Beit Hadassah, so you passed over there in the Avram Avinu neighborhood. So if you remember again, it's already going back a number of years ago, there was a beautiful little baby, Shalhevet Pas, Hashem Yikom Dama, who was playing in the playground in the Avram Avinu neighborhood, and she was murdered by a sniper in the Abu Sneh Hills. And remember again, one of the most striking images is her father. I don't remember her father's name. Her father was also injured in the shooting, and he for the levaya, he was in a wheelchair, and he was holding her. It was such a overwhelming and traumatic and dramatic thing. But the image of a father holding his little baby, taking her to Eretz Yisroel was like an overwhelming. So that's been the practice in Klal Yisrael, again already for generations, that for a young baby, now she was older already, she was already a couple of, I think 1.5 years, 2 years old, something like that, Hashem Yikom Dama, that carry out the baby. So here they're talking about within 30 days, Yotze Bechek, V'nikbar Bi'isha Achas U'shnei Anoshim. And ultimately, again, the Levaya consists even of one woman and 2 men, Avalo Bi'ish Echad U'shtei Noshim, but not 1 man and 2 women. Now that's like our Mishnah. Abba Shalom Mishal says, Afilu Bi'ish Echad U'shtei Anoshim, even with 1 man and 2 women. So you see from here that what? Abba Shalom holds, there's no yichud with 1 man and 2 women. It says, obviously not like our Mishnah, to which the Gemara says, no, both say incredible Gemara. Afilu Tema Abba Shalom. Can you give me Abba Shalom? Why? B'shas Aninus Taver Yitzrei. Incredible. See, I was saying, Abba Shalom says like this. What's the chap? Why is there an Isser Yichud? Isser Yichud is because Chazal understood that people are people. People are people. And give people the opportunity to sin. And again, we're just basar v'dam. We'll take it. Maybe not all the time, but enough time that you have to be careful with it. Yes?
Why is Torah a Yichud issue?
I'm sorry? Because they were talking about over here burying out in the field. So remember again, Yichud doesn't just have to be in closed room. Yichud is any situation where no one else is around. So for example, contemporarily, a car late at night, right, driving in isolated places could be Yichud. So it's not just a closed door, it's any isolated situation. So here, if they're burying out in the field, all you have is 1 man and 2 women, it's potentially Yichud issue. So Abba Shalom says no Yichud issue. Why? Why I will say, because Abba Shalom says there are certain times in life where the Yetzirah is just not active. So literally the Lashon is B'shas Aninos, at a time of tremendous mourning, Taver Yitzrei. Literally, it literally means the Yetzirah is broken. The Yetzirah is broken. So therefore, fascinatingly enough, Abba Shalom holds that ultimately, again, he holds that there's no, he doesn't disagree in principle with the Mishnah. He just holds that contextually or circumstantially, there are certain times where the Yetzirah is simply not active. Rabbanan Savri like Rabbi Yitzchak. Rabbanan like Rabbi Yitzchak, Ma'is onin Adam Chai, so we'll say the Gemara quotes the pasuk from Eicha, Ma'is onin Gever Chai, Gevra al Chata'ov. So literally, over what could a living person complain? Right? Ma'is onin Adam Chai, Gevra al Chata'ov. Literally translated, has a person become a master over his sins. Now, what does this mean? Afilu b'shas aninu social Adam yitzro miskaber alav. The Rabbanan disagree. The Rabbanan hold the Yetzirah is always active. Always active. Give the Yetzirah a chance. Levaya, not a Levaya, Simchas, Tzaras. The Yetzirah is the Yetzirah. Which I will say, if you think about it, is such a fundamental machlokes over here. Right? We think there's a machlokes yichud. So it's not a machlokes yichud. It's a fundamental machlokes in the fundamental nature of man. Does the Yetzer Hara ever take a break? Right? Is there ever a time where I'm not battling the internal wants and desires, lusts and proclivities that exist and reside inside of me? Abba Shalom says yes. Yes, there are times in life where the heart is so broken, where ultimately, again, the individual is so overwhelmed that the Yetzer Hara isn't even a dominant force. And the Rabbanan say, absolutely not. Absolutely not. The Yetzirah ultimately, again, is always there, and the battle is always going on. Abba Shalom kiksiv. So what does Abba Shalom do with this pasuk? This is incredible. So he says over here, Abba Shalom kiksiv hahu b'misrayim amidosav ksiv. This is incredible. Abba Shalom says this pasuk is talking about someone who goes ahead and complains, or someone who complains about HaKadosh Baruch Hu. A person who questions the ways of the Ribono Shalom. Watch this. V'achi ka'amar, ma yisra'im amidosav. How could a person go ahead and question the ways of the Ribono Shalom? So this has Darshni, ma yisonin adam chai. How could a living, breathing human being possibly find it within himself to question the ways of HaKadosh Baruch Hu? V'chi gavar al chata'av. As I say, before a person questions the ways of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, get your own house in order. Get your own house in order. Has a person overcome his own wants, his own desires, his own lusts, his own proclivities? Do I have my own spiritual house in order? In other words, sometimes we question the way HaKadosh Baruch Hu runs the world. But there's a bigger kasha. So good, that's wonderful. You could do that as long as the way you're running your world is first in order. If your house is in order, then you could question how HaKadosh Baruch Hu's house, whether it's in order or not. But it says, Abishol, there's a person that so again, the way he dashes is Ma'is, Onin Adam Chai. So tell me, it's a living person. How is it that you're complaining about HaKadosh Baruch Hu? He says, V'chi gavar al chata'av. Tell me, again, is your house in order? Are you the right giver? Have you vanquished your own desire to sin? Have you put your own spirituality, your own personalistic sin, your own personalistic home? Is that in order? That now you're questioning HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Dayo Chaim shenasati lo. You should be HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You should be happy that I'm giving you life. In other words, sometimes we'll say, and this is an incredible yesod, that sometimes it's normal and natural to question how HaKadosh Baruch Hu runs his world, right? We all see that we encounter things every single day, and Am Yisrael is living through things now that at the end of the day we wonder, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, what's the plan? What's the plan? But along with those questions has to come a certain sense of humility as well. While I'm absolutely entitled to question, I'm not entitled to indict. I could question, right? That's our tradition to always question, but to recognize that the Rebbe Shalom has his world to run, and I don't understand it. V'haraya, more often than not, I can't get my own life in order, right? I can't get my own ducks, so to speak, in a row. So if I can't get my own life in order, I'm just one person. So of course, I'm not going to be able to understand how the Ribono Shel Olam runs an entire universe. And also, an incredible yesod, we spend so much time getting caught up. And I think it's much more here in Eretz Yisroel, much less here in Eretz Yisroel, than it is often in our diaspora communities, right? We spend so much time trying to understand why this. It's good to spend a little bit less time on the why and a bit more time on the what. I'm never going to understand how HaKadosh Baruch Hu runs his world, very simply because that's not my job. It's not my job. It's not in my pay grade. It's not necessary. My job is to figure out what do I do with the circumstances of life that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has visited upon me and that He's visited upon my people. And when I find myself in overwhelming circumstances, don't spend time on the theological why, because to a certain degree that's an exercise in futility. But spend that time and spend that energy and spend those resources on the what, right? Ma Hashem Elokecha shoah mi'imach. What does HaKadosh Baruch Hu want from us? In personally trying times, in nationally trying times, if we focus our energies on the what, and it's beautiful, by the way, right? Because we're learning this drasha, right, in a room that's filled with supplies, right? So again, it's not, so this is base measures, right? That's normally used for shiurim. But in times of crisis, right? So ultimately, again, the Torah is important. Of course, Torah is always important, but so is the what. So is the actional piece as well, to try to figure out what we could do for our people and how we could be there in times of need. So let's go weiter. So the Rabbanan will say ultimately again, the Rabbanan will say, by the way, just this concept that the Zechariah applies even in times of mourning. So he quotes over here this story. So Rashi quotes over here that there was a story of a group of people that wanted to sin. Right? So what did they do? So Rashi says over here, so he says over here, Rashi Rabbanan afilu tavi yitzay v'kamei yishlachos pamim she'in sham aninos va'osen atzman kilunos and tinok meis v'yotzen la'avera ki uvda dava uvda ba'hi issa va'fikse letinok chai b'chezkas meis. Rashi recalls the story that there was once a group of people that wanted to sin. So what did they do? It's actually pretty twisted. They feigned the death of a baby. They took the baby out. The baby was alive, Baruch Hashem. Took the baby out, so to speak, for burial, quote unquote. But it was just a pretext to sin. So the Rabbanan pointing out over here that you see that people could even sometimes exploit death or utilize death as a pretense or pretend death or fictional death in order to allow for sin. All right, we'll say fine. So, but bottom line, again, there's much more to discuss about yichud, but the construct as we see it ultimately is one man is not allowed to be alone with two women. One woman could be alone with two men. There are many more. So we're not finished yet with yichud, but fundamental machlokes as whether or not in times of mourning is there still Yitzhahara or not. Abba Shaul saying no, Rabbanan saying yes. Again, it seems to me maybe it's a personal thing, but I would definitely think that halacha l'maisa and hashkafa l'maisa, the Zechariah never takes a break. Let's go right. So again, so this is the two das. So that's the end of yesterday's daf. Good. So with that, I'm actually going to record it separately as well.